And so that folk aren't disappointed, I'm going to start us with our poem as our part of our opening, because it's one of my favorite poems. Did nearly everybody get a chance to wave if you did not have a chance to run it off and you don't have a copy? Excellent, everybody has a copy. It's by James Broughton. You've heard me recite it before. He was one of the early beat poets from the San Francisco area. A bit of a wild card, a lot of fun, wonderfully gay before it was acceptable to be so. Found in the eyes of the law, the community, what have you, he partnered up with a younger man, and theirs was an incredible love story. And they were together for, I think, 30 some years. And he was a bit of an adventurer. And so I was just reading up a little bit more. The very last words that he spoke on his deathbed, he was about 86. And he said, "My creeping decrepitude has crept me all the way to the crypt." And on his tombstone, he had carved, in quotation marks, "adventure dash not predicament," which I think in some way sums up his life. And this poem is, in a sense, an invitation into adventure and a challenge for us to engage life, an Easter life, with courage. And I'm wondering sometimes if courage is one of the great gifts of the resurrection. Yes, there is still fear. Yes, there is still struggle. But we are invited to live with our hearts, the cour, and to go forward and be courageous people. But listen to what he says. Shake out your qualms, shake up your dreams. Deepen your roots, extend your branches. Trust deep water and head for the open, even if your vision shipwrecks you. Quit your addiction to sneer and complain. Open a lookout, dance on a brink, run with a wildfire. You are closer to glory, leaping an abyss than upholstering a rut. Not dawdling, not doubting, intrepid all the way, walk toward clarity. At every crossroad, be prepared to bump into wonder. And isn't that an amazing line? At every crossroad, be prepared to bump into wonder. Only love prevails. En route to disaster, insist on canticles. Lift your ineffable out of the mundane. Nothing perishes, nothing survives. Everything transforms. Honeymoon with big joy. And big joy is his idiosyncratic, personalized name for God. So you can do with that what you want. I love it when people present new names, like he says God's name is Big Joy. John Coltrane, jazz player, says the best name for God is a love supreme. And sometimes those different names jostle our thinking. But some of those lines of the challenge to be shaken up, some of it is to find our mundane, our ineffable, the spirit, the holy in the mundane, the ordinary, the everyday, the flesh, the incarnation. Only love prevails, he said. And I actually read, I forget, it was Wittgenstein, the positivist philosopher, who said, only love will enable one to see the resurrection. And I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but I'm intrigued by the line. It takes love to see the resurrection. And it feels to me almost like a self-completing loop. It takes love to see the resurrection. Once you see the resurrection, you feel the love more, which allows you to see more deeply. But we'll see, I'm not sure. And then his lovely statement at the end. Do you remember last week I was saying that one of the potential meanings of the resurrection was to be paired to the crucifixion, and so that everything falls apart in order to come together in a new creative way. And that is of the very essence of the universe and the way of God's love and creation, which is ongoing in this universe and within our lives. And so Broughton's way of saying that is nothing perishes, nothing survives, everything transforms. And that may be the very heart of the resurrection. It perishes, the body, but something survives, a new resurrection body in a moment of transformation, which is the model that leads us forth and is a promise that we ourselves might go on the same route, day by year, and beyond the limits of this place and life. Any comments or questions? Maybe, Tom, you could unmute us for a moment just about the poem. Otherwise, I'm going to head off into some other stuff. Okay. No comments. That's good. I asked.
Gary's can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Gary is muted. Gary is muted.
Okay. There. You can hear me now? Okay. Where was I? Okay. Lost my train of thought, so we'll just launch in. The first session, we looked at appearances and the nature of the resurrection being in some ways a visionary experience where Paul himself includes himself in the appearances, and it's sound and light. And then we moved to the Gospel of Mark, the first of the Gospels. So he's writing about 20, 25 years later, gathering together some material that clearly was part of an oral tradition within the early Christian communities. And then we moved to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew and Luke, as I mentioned last week, clearly took Mark as their major backbone, the chronology and the outline of the life of Jesus, and then they continued to add material to it. Matthew was writing around the year 85 to 90, Mark somewhere in the 60s, so we're looking at maybe a 15 to 20 year lag time before the second gospel started to emerge in written form. And as we mentioned, the primary things that Matthew did was to add lots of teaching, from Sermon on the Mount to some teachings that happened in Jerusalem to a lot of parables that were shared. But the basic structure remained the same. But in many of the events, Matthew kept adding little details. So he would take Mark and then insert material that he felt made things clearer or enriched the actual story as Mark had told it. And you'll see this particularly in the resurrection story. In fact, you'll see some lines from Mark that are popped in, and then you'll notice an incredible change at crucial moments. You need to remember that that Christianity was, in its beginning, a Jewish sect. The first century was a tumultuous time for Judaism. And it had hit a crisis, partly because of the Roman occupation. And in the first century, the temple was destroyed. And so people were lifting up all kinds of questions of what is it to be Jewish? And so there were at least 4 or 5 different denominations, you might say, under the umbrella of Judaism. And they were struggling for what is the path forward. So you had Sadducees, who were primarily associated with temple worship and the whole notion of sacrifice. You had the Pharisees, who were primarily focused on Torah and how you could live a righteous life in obedience to the law. You had the Essenes, those who were known from the community of Qumran, from Dead Sea Scrolls fame, and they believed that maybe the best way was to withdraw, that the only way to find purity was to build some distance between yourself and the wider community, be that both temple, Jewish, or Roman. They particularly were critical of what they thought was the corruption of the temple traditions. You then had the Zealots, who thought that the Messiah was about to break in and transform everything. And so they were the sort of the revolutionary branch of Judaism. And then you had Christian Jews, who weren't called Christian at that time. They were called people of the way. In fact, there seems to be some evidence that there was a whole group called the Ebionites, who were literally Jewish Christians. And they were Christians who said you do have to follow Jewish law, in contradistinction to Paul, and wanted to keep more firmly to their Jewish roots. After about 100 years of this whole turmoil, eventually Sadducees disappeared when the temple went. there was a revolution, and the final revolution was around 120, and the Zealots and the Jews lost horrendously, and it was sort of the end of the nation literally until 1948. It was gone until that point. The Essenes died out. It was like a monastic community that didn't renew itself. The Pharisees became what we now know as modern Judaism and the whole rabbinic tradition. And the Ebionites, the people of the way, moved into being the Christian religion. And so you're actually watching two different religions that were sisters, really, sibling religions that came from the same root. And like many siblings, there was a great deal of argument and rivalry and a poking at each other. And you'll begin to see some of that poking a little bit in Matthew, and particularly when we get to John, a whole lot of the poking, which finally became anti-Semitic. And maybe that was inevitable, hard to know. The two finally split somewhere in the 2nd century, but by the end of the 1st century, you could already see that there was going to be an inevitable crash. And unfortunately, some of those lines got incorporated into Christian thinking and emerged as an anti-Semitism that continues even to this day. And you've only to look at some of the protesters who are, quote, liberating Michigan and watching the signs that they have with swastikas and Arbeit macht frei as their sign, which was the sign over Auschwitz camp. So it keeps lingering, and part of our responsibility as Christians is to say, to what extent is Christianity responsible for, and to what extent do we need to, in fact, revisit some of the gospel stories with a larger context and understanding. It's almost perhaps inevitable because of something called supersessionism, which is a fancy $20 word saying, one faith says, I really like what the previous faith had, but they didn't have enough. And now that we're here, the faith is completed. So that's partly why Christians said we'll have the Jewish scriptures, and we're going to call it the Old Testament, and then we'll have the New Testament. And so they'll say Judaism was right, but it didn't go far enough. And so you have to have Christ, Jesus Christ, who will complete it. The irony is, of course, that in the 7th century, Muhammad came forward and said the Jews had a revelation from God, the Christians had a revelation from God. There's a lot of commentary, more commentary, say, on the Virgin Mary in the Quran than there is in the Bible. But they, again, were supersessionists and said, but you need Muhammad and the revelation of the Quran to bring the faith to completion. So it's a hard dilemma when these three Abrahamic faiths need to sit down at one table and honor each other and be in real interfaith, multi-faith dialogue. And yet underneath that is this current of, you were a good faith, but you needed us to complete it. So I just mentioned that because you're going to see a little bit of it starting to emerge in Matthew around the resurrection story. But Matthew was primarily putting his gospel together for a Jewish Christian community. More than any of the other gospel writers, he would insert, and this was to fulfill scripture. This was to fulfill what the prophets said. This is to fulfill what the law said. And you'll notice that he gives a Sermon on the Mount, which is very parallel to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. So he's very deliberately trying to say, we had Mount Sinai and the law, and now we have the Sermon on the Mount. But at the beginning of that sermon, just after the Beatitudes in the 5th chapter, Jesus says, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. There will not be one jot or tittle of the law that will be lost, but it will be fulfilled. So Matthew is trying to do this dance of saying, everything is new, but nevertheless, the old way is also good. Paul was much more upfront and said, the old way has changed, and you do not have to follow Jewish law. Matthew was a little bit more cautious. So before we get to the resurrection, I'd just like to have you turn to the material that was printed out from chapter 27. This is Matthew talking about the death of Jesus. And you'll notice if you started to compare in parallel Gospels that it's pretty much what Mark said from verse 45, from noon on darkness came over the whole land. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, why have you forsaken me? But it was at 51b that Matthew inserts. 51 starts, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That's a lift from Mark. That curtain was the fabric that separated the holiest of holies in the temple from the place of worship where most people gathered. It was so holy, in fact, that only the high priest was allowed to enter that part, and only on the Day of Atonement. So it was almost reserved holy space. And these gospel writers are saying, with Jesus, that curtain has been broken down, and we have more fluid, more, Evelyn, good to see you. And we have more personal presence to be with God. So both of them are saying that. And then Matthew can't help but add some special effects. The earth shook and the rocks were split. And not Mark, but Matthew says, this is a big deal. So the whole earth is in sympathy with the crucifixion, and you get your earthquake and the splitting of rocks. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, a euphemism for dead, were raised. And after his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many, which would be weird. And if you were reading much Borg or Crossan, they say, it didn't happen. Because if it had, lots of people would be saying, we saw the zombies, we saw the dead walking. And there is no other mention of that in any of the literature except for this part of the gospel. But I think what Matthew is partly doing, if you recall, last time we were talking about one of the meanings of the resurrection, is that it includes the promise of resurrection for everyone. But that Jesus is the first to be resurrected. And then when you come to the time of fulfillment, the end times, the kingdom of God finally coming into its fullness of being, then other people will be resurrected. And Christians and Jews were always challenged by saying, what's going to happen to all the good people, the saints, the Moseses, the Abrahams, the Jeremiahs, who had died faithful before Jesus? And so there is a sense in which they also shall all be raised up. And in fact, you got a tradition called the harrowing of hell, because many people thought, what did Jesus actually do on Saturday? He died on Friday, on Sunday morning was raised. And what was he doing? Just sleeping or just resting? And part of the tradition was, and it's mythological, but that he went down to hell and had a fight with Satan, won the day, and then pulled all the dead with him. And you can go to some of the iconography of the Orthodox Church, and it's called the Anastasis, where Jesus is pictured as coming out of his tomb or out of a coffin and dragging behind him some of the holy people who had died before, which is to say that the resurrection of Jesus is not just a singular event for him, but it is a promise of life for us, for those who have gone before, a promise of life for all creation. Okay, then the second page, the guard at the tomb. And this is the place you're going to find that Matthew, alone of them, is wrestling with the accusation that resurrection was simply disciples stealing the body and then spreading rumors. And you'll notice at the opening, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days, I will rise again." So they got Pilate to set up a guard of soldiers to make it secure, and they sealed it with a stone. So you're starting to see Matthew countering what some folk were saying about the resurrection. And he particularly at the end will say, this is what the Jews said, that the body had been stolen, i.e. they were non-believers in the resurrection. So I just included that for a little bit of background. Maybe Tom, if anybody has a question or a comment, wave your hand and Tom will unmute you, or you unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to launch right into Matthew 28. Okay, Matthew 28, up and coming. I just need to say, by the way, I think I said it last time, how much I appreciate the fact that we're all here together, because I did it so that we could have a Bible study, and I actually have found it personally exciting to keep working on these gospel stories. And every time that I send you off with one of those questions, you think, oh, groan, what does it really mean to me? You just need to know that I've been living with that question most of the week. And so it's an opportunity for faith refreshment and to see new possibilities, and particularly in a time of pandemic, when we're struggling with how the world is changing, and the death is always omnipresent, but it feels more particularly that way in these present times, and the anxiety of not knowing where it's all headed. So I couldn't think of a better time for us to be saying, what is the resurrection? Okay, so Matthew 28, unfortunately it all fit on one page. So a very similar beginning. The two women, in this case it was three in Mark, but we're down to two, but always Mary Magdalene, she's a constant, and the other Mary, whoever she was. And suddenly there was a great earthquake. So it's like an echo. At the crucifixion, you get an earthquake, and the world seems to fall apart. And then at the resurrection, you get a second earthquake. And now, remember in Mark, it was a young man dressed in white. Well, Matthew upgrades and says, no, it was an angel of the Lord descending from heaven. And Mark never addressed the problem of how the rock got moved. It just sort of happened. And Matthew says, okay, that's a problem. Okay. The angel who descended from heaven came and rolled back the stone and was sitting on it, which there's some of me that smiles at that image of the women coming along and wondering what will happen to the stone, and then suddenly the earth shakes and an angel descends, pushes the stone, and suddenly is perched on top. And not just an ordinary young man, but his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And if you didn't think he was scary, he immediately puts it in, for fear of him the guards shook and became like dead men. So it was a fearsome thing. And in a practical way, we got rid of the guards. So yes, we have guards, but they're knocked out of the scene just from sheer fright. So in some ways, whatever this resurrection is, its precursors with this lightning-like angel who is addressing the women, startles everyone. And then the message that they speak is almost identical to what is in Mark. So do not be afraid. Remember, it was do not be alarmed in Mark, but it's that same reassurance. Be not afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus. Remember, who was crucified. He's not here. Still the passive. He has been raised. As he said, come and see. It's empty. He's going ahead into Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for him. So it's almost identical to what Mark said. But then comes this incredible change. And this is quite amazing. So they left the tomb. And remember, in Mark, it was with traumos and ecstasis, with terror and amazement. Here it has become, they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. In Mark, traumos, ecstasis, and they told no one. So Matthew is looking and saying, not a good ending, folks, not a good ending at all. And so the women still have fear, but they also have joy, and they are obedient to the message, and they run to tell the disciples. Big change. I love this combination, though, of fear and joy. And I think that's partly the promise of resurrection, that there was joy, and it will be the joy of faith and of love and of hope, but it does not mean there's no fear. It's very much like Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Like there is evil, there is pain and suffering. The invitation is be not afraid and have the joy. But it is, I think, a realistic assessment, and that feels so appropriate again. I tell myself this over and over in this pandemic time, particularly at 2 in the morning. be not afraid, but there's lots of fear, but be of good faith and hope and joy. And actually, I can usually get myself to sleep by the third repetition of the 23rd Psalm. Sort of just drift off. But it's that balance of fear and joy, and you embrace it with courage. And that's what we are called to do. And I'm intrigued because Matthew decides, or the tradition is, that in fact the women meet Jesus now as they're rushing to tell the disciples. Suddenly in verse 9, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him and took hold of his feet, so that he wasn't just a vision, like there's actual feet to take hold of. And so you have to keep wrestling with not a resuscitation of flesh and blood and bones, but something that is more than a ghost or an hallucinatory vision. There's something to hold on to. Paul would say it's a spiritual body or a resurrected body. And I think he's trying definitely to say there's something tangible, but it's not like what we know. Do you remember back, this is going back, but in Matthew earlier, the Sadducees came and tried to trick Jesus in saying, if there is an afterlife, if there is a heaven, what happens to a woman whose husband dies and she marries his brother, and that brother dies and she marries the next brother and the next brother? And it's a tragic story for the 7 brothers who all die, but she ends up being the husband to all of them, which is what the law commands, that if your husband dies and you're childless, the brother has to step up and help out. And so they say, so who is she married to? Who is she married to in heaven? And Jesus, oh, for heaven's sakes, it isn't like that in heaven. And you think, but that's one of the best parts of having a body. But no, you're not married. Okay, it's something different. It reminds me of a passage, this is me just ad-libbing, but if you reread the opening book of Paradise Lost, and Adam and Eve are talking to the angel, and Adam goes up to the angel and says, I'm not trying to be intrusive, but do you angels have the same kind of enjoyment that Eve and I have together? And the angel had a rosy blush upon his cheek and said something like, we do it differently in heaven, we melt. So there's this wrestling with what is this body? And there is no answer. But the proclamation is that there is something real about this Jesus. You're not just having an hallucination, or you're not just tripping as if you take an acid or something. There's something real that 2 people see together, and they hold his feet and they worship him. Now this might be the place just to add another little phrasing from Marcus Borg, because in the life of Jesus, he basically said, don't worship me, we all worship God. And so Borg says there is what he calls a pre-Easter Jesus, who is primarily the healer, the teacher, the guy who's filled with spirit, builds a community, and works for social justice and inclusion and offers forgiveness. But he said there is what he would call a post-Easter Jesus, who has been resurrected and now is filled with the Spirit of God and has divinity. And how you hold these together is a $20 question. But he's trying to say Jesus, when he was walking around in full humanity, wasn't God. And the later church kept wrestling back and forth because there's no easy explanation other than saying it's a paradox, or it's a mystery, or it's a contradiction that we live into and live out. But you have pre-Easter, post-Easter, you have this moment of revelation. And I thought, these 2 women are so much luckier than the 3 women in Mark. Why didn't Jesus appear to the 3 women in Mark? And I wonder if it has something to do with the fear and the joy and the obedience. That is, you see Jesus in a resurrected form when you have some of the joy or some of the expectation or some of the hope. That is to say, I've sometimes used the phrase that to see to the depth of things, you need what I call resurrection glasses, that you put on a framework and a hope and a belief and a trust that in the world you will in fact bump into wonder. You will bump into the wonder that is the presence of Jesus, that is somehow continuous with with the holy and with the teacher Jesus of the Gospels, but only if you expect. And the first three women, terror and fear, and ran and hid. The second two, fear and joy, and went to tell the disciples. I'm not sure. It could just be Matthew saying, no, we need to have one appearance in Jerusalem. So once again, as he said, do not be afraid. So you now have the angel saying, do not be afraid, and you have Jesus saying, do not be afraid. So then we have another little paragraph from verse 11 to 15, which is Matthew picking up once again on the guards, wanting to make sure that his listeners know this is not a case of grave robbing. This is not that the body has somehow been spirited away and that he hadn't, in fact, risen, that it was just robbery. And he goes on and he says, so they took the money, like the Jewish authorities assembled with the elders. They devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, you must say, his disciples came by night and stole them while you were asleep. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story is still told among the Jews to this day. And I can't help but be reminded, I'm doing a semi-binge on Ozark. I don't know if any of you have been watching Ozark. I don't really think I'd recommend it. People are being murdered almost every single time. But the notion of giving people a big pile of money and tell them to lie or to pretend is like one of the core principles of the Ozark show. And here we have it right again. We will just give you lots of money and now you'll lie for us. And the soldier said, oh, sure. But there's that little touch of blaming the Jews, or at least blaming the Pharisees and the elders for clearly promoting what for Matthew was a lie. Okay, now we come to the great appearance that Matthew sets up for the disciples and for us. And it is called the Great Commission. So the 11 disciples, and remember when we were looking at Paul's appearances, he said the 12 disciples, Matthew, a little more accurate, Judas is out of the picture. And we haven't had time to appoint Matthias as a replacement number 12. So we have the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. We didn't hear the directions, didn't know which mountain. Some people suggest that it might have been the same mountain as the Sermon on the Mount. Others say, well, there was the Mount of Transfiguration, which in some ways was a foretaste of resurrection. Remember, that's when Jesus was shining with a bright, bright light, and on one side was Moses and the other side was Elijah, and a voice came and said, this is my son with whom I am well pleased, a repeat of the baptismal statement. So it was almost on top of the mountain that you'd had a revelation of the inner core of Jesus as being full of energy and light and holiness. And now, again, on top of the mountain, we have the appearance. And when they saw him, this must be one of my favorite lines, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And I've always thought, oh, this is a faith that I can be part of. That there are moments when I'm full of belief and I'm worshiping away, and then there are other times I'm part of the, but some doubted. And you remember that wonderful line from the Roman centurion, oh Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. And I suspect that all of us have had moments like that, that we're walking the path and we're clear, and then questions come, or some untoward event happens, or there's something personal, or you look again at the evidence or your life or the scriptures. And so there was that sense, and you don't know who, and you don't know whether it was just a temporary or whether what actually was meant there. And I appreciate Matthew's honesty, because I think that gives space for all of us to be in there and to say it's an exalted moment. You're seeing the resurrected Christ, and some are worshiping and some are doubting. And that's the blessed wonder of a congregation. That's partly why we say at the very beginning, no matter where you are in your faith journey, you're welcome. You come with moments of certainty, you come with doubts and questions, you come because somehow you're hungry. And so they had enough faith and trust and joy to get to the mountain, and they actually saw something, and they had some doubts. And then Jesus came and said to them, all authority on earth and in heaven has been given to me. So again, this goes back to the resurrection is a vindication of the way of Jesus, saying Jesus is Lord, not Caesar, not the high priest, not anything else but Jesus. And I think this fits again with the post-Easter Jesus. The pre-Easter Jesus was somebody who had inherent inner authority, but wasn't able to practice it because of the realities of the world. That is to say, ended up being crucified. But now he claims, I have all authority, I am the center, and that you are invited to say, Jesus is Lord. And then says, go therefore, and look at that word go. Go therefore and make disciples. So the discipleship is not just confined to the inner circle of the 12 or the larger group of women and friends and men who followed, maybe there were 50, but to all disciples and of all nations. So this was not just a movement of possibility for Jews. It was that, but it was for all nations. And you recall that right at the very beginning with Abraham and the great promise, he was called to make a great people who will be a blessing for all the world. And inherent within Judaism always has been that they are a special people, yes, but they're special in order to spread good news or a word to the whole world. And this is Matthew picking this up and saying, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus, of the way, but yes, I am also Jewish in my roots and my history. And I'm picking up that Jewish tradition that we are now called to spread this to all the nations, regardless of color, ethnicity, wherever they find. And this is a challenge for all of us, I think, when we're tempted to become interning. And I see some of that, and maybe it's not fair because I'm pointing at them down south, but a certain branch of white evangelical Christianity in the United States might hear all nations, all people, as opposed to self-limiting salvation to yourself. And then you are to baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And that's the only place, really, other than one line in Paul, where there's a mention of what you would call a Trinity. And people are suggesting that that got snuck in by a later monk, that the word baptize was there, baptizing them. And by the time a monk was doing a manuscript, thought, yes, but we baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so that got in there because in the year 70, they had not worked out a Trinitarian theology. On the other hand, some scholars argue this is a sign that Trinitarian theology began early and that people were already aware that there's the Creator and there is Jesus, the Son, and there's clearly an experience of Holy Spirit that they would date to Pentecost or something like that. And they've experienced all three. So maybe this is the actual beginning of saying God in three persons. And then, and I'm almost done, we have one more verse. And teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And I'm fascinated that the word is obey. It's a question more of obedience. Jesus didn't say so that they will believe that I am the Son of God, but that they will in fact begin to practice a way of life, a way that is the Jesus way, which is I think why the earliest followers of Jesus were called, they are people of the way. So when you think of obedient to all that I have commanded you, you remember his commandments, love your enemies, love your neighbor. You are commanded to forgive each other. And you can start to go through, and it's fascinating to watch the places and the lines that you might think of as commands from Jesus. There aren't very many, and nearly all of them have to do with love and forgiveness, and prayer and inclusion. And so if you do follow what Jesus commanded, you will in fact be following the way of love. And then a grand conclusion, and remember, I am with you always to the end of the age, to the end of the aeon, the end of time, which is a promise of a never-ending presence of the risen Christ, no matter what. Whether you be in the middle of a pandemic, whether you be sound asleep, whether you be in feasting and breaking bread, whether you be in sorrow or in doubt, or whether you be full of joy and walking on the beach on a day like today, the presence of this love, of this big joy, of this ineffability, this Jesus is with you always. And again, watch the skill, because it takes you right back to the very beginning. And Matthew was one of the gospel writers who put in a birth narrative, and he rooted it in Emmanuel. And remember how we start Advent? First hymn in the hymn book, O come, Emmanuel. And Emmanuel translates as God with us. And so we're getting the promise in the last line of God is with us, i.e. Emmanuel. And it is precisely because God is with us, or the risen Christ is with us, that we will have the strength and the power to go and to make disciples of all people and to baptize. Now, some of you will remember that in our church we have the east window. And there is no, how do I do this too? I'm going to try and shift this a little bit. I'm not going to do this for long, but do you remember that when you finish the service and you start walking out the center aisle and you look up to the east window, you have this incredible stained glass window that was made by Gabriel Loire in the glassworks and his company in Chartres. And this is a visual expression of what is called the Great Commission, which is from here: go therefore and make disciples of all nations. It is also one of the lines that got added into the longer ending of Mark. I think it's verse 15 of chapter 16. So not the short ending at verse 8 where they didn't tell anybody, but it is the same thing: go and make disciples of all nations. And so when we finally get back to the sanctuary, I invite you to take a close look at the window and actually maybe meditate on it and say, it's rooted in this sending forth into the world. It's clearly Jesus saying, you can't stay on the mountain and the high emotional experience. This is it. But I promise I'll be with you, and go do the work of love. Now, Christianity tried to follow that. It is what you would call a missionary faith. Mission is simply coming from the Latin mittere, meaning to be sent or to send. So a missionary is one who has been sent, rooted in this: go, therefore, and make disciples. And I'm intrigued that both Islam and Christianity are sending forth and conversion of other kinds of faiths. They are missionary based. And at their very best, it is a way of grace, because when the early Christians were around, they did not have power. And so they needed to simply share their faith through conversation, sometimes through argument. They had to share their faith through their demonstrations, as in, they'll know we are Christians by our love, There is actually some non-Christians who say, we are attracted. We did not know how much they could love each other. And Christians, early Christians, set up communities that became models of grace and love that made other people want to check them out and say, I don't understand this. And that, for me, is Christian missionary work at its very best, that you are modeling through actions of love. And then people come and say, can you help me understand? Why is it you're doing this? And can I be part of it? And that's when you say, well, let me tell you. And you give them a little mini sermonette. Or you just tell your own personal story. Well, I'm not claiming huge truth, but all I can tell you is, for me, this is what happened. At its worst, Christianity, and I would say Islam is in the same boat. You convert at the edge of the sword, and you use political power. And so in the year 313, instead of being an outlawed religion that suffered much persecution, Christianity became the state religion with the Emperor Constantine. And then you had to be a Christian if you wanted to get on in life. It's a little bit like the 1950s. I was just a kid, so I don't know really what was happening, but I've heard stories that if you wanted to get ahead in business, you'd better belong to a church, because the men's club plus the Rotary plus Sunday morning was the place you made all your connections. And it's that same sense of a conversion that happens for expediency. Again, if you're watching the Ozarks, I did see you smile, Wilma. They decided that they would build a church as part of their schemes of corruption. And that's, I digress. But you need to notice that kind of missionary impulse, and it comes up now and then, over and over in Christianity. So there would be domestic evangelism in the United States. That I think of that as our nearest neighbor, and in Canada. But in the 19th century, you had great preachers that went, and there was a great movement of revival where people would be suddenly refreshed in their faith. And there was in the 19th century a very mixed movement of sending missionaries around the world. That was particularly a Protestant ethos. Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists would go out and try to convert people. And at its best, I hear stories of people offering care and love and compassion and being very gentle in how they shared their faith. And at its worst, it was threatening, and you got rice bowl Christians, as in, promise you'll come to church and we'll give you some food. So it was almost outright bribery, and it led to a very mixed record. The challenge, particularly for the United Church, is for us to understand what it means for us to share our faith. How can we reclaim the word evangelist? Because evangelism has such baggage with it in our day and time. The minute you say evangelical or evangelist or evangelism, I don't know about you, but I immediately see a slick-haired back, suited, slimy shuckster TV guy who's asking for my money and says, if you just put your hand upon the TV, you shall be cured. Just believe. And I gather, somebody told me it was Jimmy Baker, but I can't believe it if he got out of prison. But he will sell you a vial that has been blessed by God and Jesus and will cure the coronavirus. And you think, slay me, God, slay me. And I keep going around saying I'm a Christian, but not that kind of Christian. On the other hand, what I've discovered often with the United Church is that we are so shy and worried about being taken for being one of those Christians that we shut up and say almost nothing about our faith. So I think I told some of you once upon a time when I was up at Ryerson, I had a friend who had made big metal crosses that you pinned onto your shirt or your blouse or your coat. And I distributed them to free for everybody in the congregation. So about 200, 250 people pinned these on. And I said, wear them for a week and then come back and we're going to talk about the conversations that you've had. And some people came back and said, nobody said a word. They didn't notice. Another woman came back and said, I was with my golf foursome. And they said, have you lost your mind, Edith? And she said, the minister made me do it. But they said they actually had opportunity for fascinating conversations because people were intrigued. People are careful and cautious because they don't want it shoved down their throat, or they don't want to be threatened with hell, and they don't want to, you know what it's like. But the question is, how do we do it? So I'm going to, you know what, we're going to have more time in breakout. We're only going to have one breakout group this time because I've talked more than I anticipated. We're going to have to tackle John 21 on another week because I want you to have some time in a breakout group, and to have more information will be just too much. So there are two key questions. One is just the one I've been mentioning. How do you share your faith in the everyday world? Do you talk about it? Are you shy about talking about it? Do you enact it? I've had somebody come up and just say, if you didn't tell them you were a Christian, Gary, would they know by your life and by your actions? And I sometimes cringe a little thinking, maybe. I'm not always 100% sure. Do I share my faith? There was a little joke from a little youngster. I read it in a joke book, and he was talking to his father and said, does our minister have a friendship with God, or is it just what you'd call a professional relationship? And I thought, is that what I come across as, a guy who has a professional relationship with God? So the question is, how, when do you share your faith? And I want that to be connected with a variation of last week's question. Last week I said, what is the meaning of the resurrection? And gave a long list of Jesus lives, Jesus is vindicated, that he's been a victor over the powers, over sin, over death. It's the promise of life. It's the promise of transformation. Same question, but differently phrased. What difference for you does the resurrection mean? To heck with a long list of this is what it means. What difference does it make for you in your day-to-day life? Might not be much, might be a huge amount, might be rooted in one experience that has sustained you. You might say, it's because I trust that Jesus will be with me always, that promise, or that I'm following the way of love, or I am reassured about what happens after for me or my loved ones. I don't know what it would be for you. Does the resurrection give you courage? Does it allow you to live into life, not abolishing fear, but the fear being balanced by a joy and a trust? So 2 questions. How do I share my faith? And what difference does the resurrection mean for me? And in fact, it might make more sense to start with the second question. What difference does it make? Because that might be what you end up sharing. If you end up saying it doesn't make any difference, there may not be much to share. So those 2 questions.